Welcome to the latest Defence Review podcast. This episode stars Colonel Tim Collins, and he shares his views on today's woke army, our inability to defeat an aggressor, and how Russia could regroup and be ready to hit Europe in 2 to 3 years. You're known as one of the best motivators of soldiers in the British Army, and indeed your pre-battle speech to your battalion in 2003 before the invasion of Iraq is legendary. Do you think that today's troops are motivated in the same way?
Well, I think what has motivated troops in the past, by and large, is still what motivates and animates them today. The single difference, I think, that today is that the concept of the regimental system has been much watered down. And that was the differentiator that made our regiments and battalions better than anybody else's. And I suspect that there's people, certainly within the sort of left of politics, who felt very frightened and like all socialists, because they couldn't control that, they needed to destroy that. And that was the motivation, to get rid of the regimental system. It has reduced the army down to the bones of a what could I say? It's a sort of it's gone from being the most professional army in the world to a sort of 18 to 30s club with a bit of a military theme. And it's got to a stage, especially we feel in the Royal Irish Regiment in particular, very bitter about what has happened, because we have soldiers who join from across the community in Northern Ireland and across the island in Ireland, indeed people who come from the Irish diaspora in Canada and Australia and New Zealand to join Irish regiments. But what's happening is, because we could recruit 2 more battalions in 6 months, but because our recruiting is so robust and the recruiting group capita has failed so badly elsewhere, Irishmen who are turning up for training at Catterick are being told at the end of their training, you're going to the Lancashires, you're going to the goodness knows who's. And they're like, I don't want to be in the army anymore. I've come to serve with Irishmen. If I'm not serving as Irishman, I want nothing to do with you. And they're like, you don't understand, this is a groovy thing and it's going to be more diverse. And they're like, we don't want to be here anymore. We just want to go home.
And so where did this politicization start?
I think it started really with Tony Blair. And Tony Blair was like a sort of poor man's Cliff Richards, who just wanted to put the shoe right on here, kids. And it just didn't work, and everything was half-assed, and it's never got better again. So I think Tony Blair's election in 1987 was the nail in the coffin to British defence. But he was a man who was happy to use it to embolden his position and flatter himself. But increasingly, he became an expert within 30 minutes, and then he wanted to tinker with it, and then he completely buggered it.
Can that be changed now, do you think?
I think what will happen is in a very British traditional sense, we will become involved in a major conflict. We will suffer a horrendous defeat or a series of horrendous defeats. If we survive that, what somebody will do, merging from the ashes, is to say, I know, why don't we recruit regiments on a regional basis, almost on a tribal basis, so that way people can serve together and defend their locale, and they'll have higher morale. Somebody said, that's a good idea. That's never been done before. Let's do that. I wrote an article, I think in 2018, 2019 for the Sunday Telegraph. I headlined with the words of another Ulsterman from my regiment, Sir Henry Wilson, who said, the danger of having an army that exists enough to provoke trouble, but too small to do anything about it, is negligible. We should either have an effective army or no army at all. The Right On Brigade, who were drooling over their reviews and star rating from Stonewall and other organizations, and the recruiting basis that they're achieved. But people on the inside of the army were saying it's no longer effective. My point was, and my son was a serving officer at the time, is that the parents of serving soldiers are going to lose them dead in combat, because people in command have surrounded them with people who are incapable of doing their job. And the capable ones aren't able to fill the gaps. And so they'll all collectively die in the name of diversity and wokeness. The British Ministry of Defence has more diversity focus groups than we have working Challenger 2 tanks. Surely that can't be right.
And where do you think the next conflict might start?
Oh, from the Russians, the likelihood that the confrontation will be in the northern flank and in the central area. The Poles, the Lithuanians, the Estonians, and the Latvians, along with the Finns and the Swedes, and to a certain degree the Norwegians, have far better armies than we do. And so they will take the brunt of the fighting. We'll be a bit of a backstop. But if they're defeated, we have no chance. Recently at the Energy Security Conference in Texas, when somebody asked a similar question about if the Russians aren't doing very well in Ukraine, how could they ever beat us? Well, history will tell us exactly how. The Russians suffered a catastrophic defeat in 1905 in Port Arthur. Their entire fleet was sunk by the Japanese and their army heavily defeated. They came back, and the thing they changed was that they took total power from the Tsar and they created a Duma, and they started to rebuild their army. At which point, by 1912, the German General Staff, and that's 7 years later, looked at the Russian army and said, by 1916, the Russian army, at the rate it's rebuilding, will crush us, and there won't be a thing we can do about it. And we can only survive if we attack this year or next. In fact, they attacked 2 years in 1914, because that was the reality. So a defeated Russian army, even if they stopped yesterday or even carried on, if they start to rebuild the capacity they can do, in 5 to 6 years' time, they will have an army which we cannot withstand.
Now, don't forget to keep updated at www.defencereview.uk and subscribe to the next podcast wherever you get yours, and join us for the next explosive episode with Colonel Tim Collins and me, Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford.